Welcome to the Level 1 Portfolio Management Summary video series. This video is a summary of the reading on Basics of Portfolio Planning and Construction.
Here. So, portfolio planning, for example, is discussed in the previous reading, and in this reading I've consolidated it all over here. When we talk about this portfolio management process, we have three stages: planning, execution, feedback. In planning, we understand the client's needs and we prepare the IPS. You need to know the major components of the IPS, which are shown right here. The ones that I will highlight are right here. Investment objectives. IPS clearly needs to say what is the investment objective of our client, and these objectives will include risk objectives and return objectives. What are the constraints? And constraints we'll talk about. There are the 5 constraints, such as liquidity and tax concerns and so on. And then what are the investment guidelines? How do we evaluate whether we are meeting our objectives? And then there are various appendices. So be aware of the components, but understand that the most important components are the risk return objectives and the constraints. After planning, we do execution. So based on the IPS and based on market conditions, we come up with an appropriate asset allocation. So how much percent should go in stocks, how much should go in bonds. Then we do a security analysis, what to buy, and then construct the portfolio. And then feedback is where we monitor and rebalance, and we also do performance measurement and reporting. Portfolio planning can be defined as a program developed in advance of constructing a portfolio that is expected to satisfy the client's objectives. So we are just talking in a little more detail about planning here. The written document governing this process is the IPS. It defines a plan for investment success given the client's situation and requirements. The IPS should be reviewed on a regular basis. Risk objectives. Risk objectives are specifications for portfolio risk that reflect the risk tolerance of the client. Overall risk tolerance depends on the willingness and ability to take risk. The ability to take risk is based on wealth, time horizon, expected income, etc. So the ability of an investor to take risk is generally more objective, whereas the willingness is subjective. The willingness to take risk is subjective and is based on the client's psychology. Some people are just more risk taking than others. And how we come up with this risk tolerance is described in Exhibit 1, but in the summary crash course, I'm just emphasizing the 2 main points. Risk tolerance can generally be expressed qualitatively as high, medium, low. So in actual IPS, you often just say that the risk tolerance is either high, medium, or low. You often don't give a number. Quantitative risk objectives can be expressed in absolute or relative terms. So if you actually do want to give a number, especially for sophisticated institutional investors, then how can you do it? An absolute example would be this: the portfolio should not suffer more than a 5% loss in any 12-month period. So this is in absolute terms and it's quantified. But then a more practical way of stating this is as follows: with 95% probability, the portfolio should not lose more than 5% value in any 12-month period. This, for those who recognize the material, is also called value at risk. But this value at risk material is covered in detail at level 3. Here, just recognize that it's one way of expressing how much risk an individual or an institution can take. Relative risk measure is shown here. Return should be within 4% of the S&P 500. So we are saying that S&P 500 is up and down, and we are saying that our portfolio should be within a band of the S&P 500. So clearly the risk of our portfolio is being expressed relative to the risk of the S&P 500. Then we come to return objectives. Return objectives can be stated on an absolute or relative basis. So here is an absolute example. The client wants to achieve a particular return, say a return of 9%. Unless stated otherwise, this is a nominal return. Sometimes the client actually might be concerned about buying power, in which case the client will say an inflation adjusted real return of 2%. In relative terms, the client might say 3% greater than the 12-month LIBOR, So again, this is relative, or return equal to the S&P 500 index. These are both examples of relative. So if you have a situation where S&P goes down by 5% and your portfolio is down by 4%, then we say that this did well. Return requirement can be stated before or after fees. So we need to be very clear when we state this, that our return requirement is on, let's say, an after fee basis. Stated risk and return objectives obviously must be compatible. You can't have a situation where the risk tolerance is way below average, so the client doesn't want to take risk but wants a very high return. So that does not make sense. You need to educate the client if that's what he is asking for. Investment constraints. These are the 5 constraints that you need to remember, and the way I like to help people remember is TTLLU. So T stands for time horizon, that's the first one. Then tax concerns. Then LL, so liquidity, legal, and then unique circumstances. So just say that a few times. TTLLU. Right, so what does time horizon mean? This is the time horizon for which you are investing. If you are young and have a good job and you have some savings, your time horizon might be long. So clearly that will have an impact on the sorts of investments you can make. Tax concerns. Some people might be in high tax brackets, others might be in low tax brackets, and that will impact the sort of investments that can be made, or the investments that should be made. Obviously, people in high tax brackets might be more interested in municipal bonds, which are tax exempt. This is the requirement related to withdrawing funds from the portfolio. So when it comes to liquidity, there is both expected and unexpected liquidity. You can think of a situation where you want to pay for your child's education after 2 years. So you know that for that you will need $100,000. Is that a liquidity need? Yes. Is it expected and known? Yes. Another scenario is where you are very injury prone and you do not have health insurance. So you constantly, you believe that you need to have a stash of money so that in case you get injured, you can pay for your expenses. So you don't know exactly how much you will need and when you will need it, but you do have a liquidity need. So clearly, when a client has a high liquidity requirement, that has an impact on the sorts of investments you make. Simplistically, you would then want to put money in liquid, relatively safe investments. You would not want to put money then in the stock market, because the stock market can suddenly crash and it might turn out that when you need the money, that's when the market is down. Legal and regulatory, this applies more to institutions. So for example, pension funds in given countries might have certain restrictions. Banks need to invest money. They might have certain regulations that impact their investment decisions. And then unique circumstances, you might have investors who say that we do not want to invest in alcohol, tobacco, firearms. So you can have socially conscious investors, you can have Islamic investors. So with unique investments, you need to be concerned about the circumstances, the unique circumstances of a client that are not covered up here. You can have a socially conscious investor, and whatever that investor wants has to be documented in the IPS so that the investment manager then makes the appropriate investment decisions and recommendation. Now this is a slide from the curriculum, or an exhibit from the curriculum, that shows different kinds of clients, individual investors and then various sorts of institutions. For individual investors, obviously the time horizon will vary, the risk tolerance will vary, the income and the liquidity needs will vary. But for institutional investors, depending on the sort of institution, the typical scenario is listed right here. Defined benefit pension plans, typically the horizon is long term, risk tolerance is high. Generally, if the horizon is long term, then you will note that the risk tolerance is high. So I want you to go through this slide or the exhibit in the curriculum and make sure you understand it, because there are several questions at the end related to this information. Capital market expectations and strategic asset allocation. So the IPS is based on the client, and you as an investment manager should also have a view on how the market is going to perform. You put these two together and maybe you use some sort of an optimization program that you have, and come up with the strategic asset allocation. By strategic asset allocation, we are talking about how much of the money should go into stocks, how much should go into bonds, and how much should go into other asset classes. You are not deciding on the specific stocks or the specific bonds, you are just deciding on the high level asset classes. With time, the asset allocation will drift from target allocation. So let's say your strategic asset allocation is 60% in stocks and 40% in bonds. You make the investment accordingly. Now, will the relative weightage stay the same or will it drift? It will obviously drift. If stocks do well, then this might go up to 70%. Then you as an investment manager need to rebalance. You rebalance by selling stocks and buying bonds so that you come back to this allocation. The frequency with which rebalancing needs to happen and how it needs to happen is covered in detail at level 3. But all you need to recognize here is that rebalancing is needed, and the process for rebalancing is defined in the IPS, typically in the appendix. Specifying asset classes. So just as a general point, when you put your clients' money in different asset classes, you obviously need to be aware of the correlation between asset classes. So that's the point here. When defining the strategic asset allocation, it is important to consider the asset class correlation matrix. So each of these are different asset classes: equities, currencies, hedge funds, real estate. These are different asset classes, and the same applies over here. Actually, there's a slight issue here. This is fixed income. This should also be fixed income. So notice the correlation between equities and equities is 1, but correlation between fixed income and equities is minus 0.35. Correlation between hedge fund and equities is 0.64. So the diversification concept kicks in. You want to put money in different asset classes that have a low correlation. This shows that the correlation between private equity and equities is high, which would imply that putting money in equities and private equity does not give you a big diversification benefit. But putting money in equities and fixed income will give you a diversification benefit because the correlation is low. So what is an asset class? It's a category of assets with similar characteristics. Examples here are equities, fixed income, and so on. Given the matrix on the left, which asset class is most sharply distinguished from equities? This is terminology from the curriculum. When they say most sharply distinguished, this means which asset class has the lowest correlation. So the answer would be fixed income. What is lower, pairwise correlations between asset classes or pairwise correlations between assets in the same asset class? Assets in the same asset class, if you have an asset class called assets, called equity, and then there's a certain correlation between the various stocks, then you have another asset class called fixed income. So obviously the correlation between equity and fixed income will be lower than the correlation between stocks which are all in the same asset class. So that's why when we do diversification, the first thing that we do is invest in different asset classes. Steps towards an actual portfolio. Strategic asset allocation is a means of providing the investor with exposure to the systematic risks of asset classes in proportions that meet the risk and return objectives. It drives a significant percentage of the overall return. So this is the stage where you say 60% in stocks, 40% in bonds. Then there is something called tactical asset allocation, where you would say that, okay, the strategic is 60-40, but I am currently very bullish on stocks. I think for the next 6 months, the stock market will do really well, and I don't think that the bond market will do that well. So temporarily, you can have an allocation of 65-35. This is a tactical allocation that deviates a little from the strategic allocation. And then the final step is security selection. You are putting 65% of your client's money in stocks, but you also need to decide which stocks to buy. That process is called security selection. Something that you will see in detail at level 3, but just a quick remark over here: risk budgeting. Risk budgeting is the process of deciding on the amount of risk to assume in a portfolio, the overall risk budget. So the total risk is called the risk budget, and then subdividing that risk into the sources of investment returns. This is called risk budgeting. And I'll just give you a simple example to illustrate, and then, as I said, details at level 3. If you think about it, one aspect of risk is based on the strategic asset allocation. Obviously, if one investor is 90% stocks and 10% bonds versus another who is 50% stocks, 50% bonds, are these two investors A and B taking a different amount of risk? Yes. So one aspect of risk is the strategic asset allocation. Then let's say that in the 50% stock category, you can either put all your money in a mutual fund that tracks an index, in which case you are not trying to do any security selection. You are just going with the regular diversified portfolio of stocks based on an index. But a risky strategy there would be to try to pick 5 stocks that will do really well, right? So clearly there's some risk involved there. Now, how you allocate your risk is basically falls under this discussion of risk budgeting. Passive strategy versus active strategy. Passive strategy means essentially to invest in some index-based fund. Active strategy means that you actually try to pick the securities that are undervalued. Core satellite approach to investing. This says that you have a core portfolio that is maybe based on an index, so you're not taking a risk there. And then you take 10% of your portfolio and call that the satellite, and there you do security selection. So there you take some risks.
If you found this lecture helpful, then I'll be very grateful if you can do 3 things for me. Number 1, like this video. Number 2, like my Facebook page. And number 3, visit analystforum.com and there add my logo to your studying with profile. You can see this slide for help on how to do that. Thank you very much and good luck with your studies.